Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We had some serious, stiff competition in this time slot, so thank you for deciding to join us. We're very happy to be here. We are going to talk about privacy and identity and incident response. We'll talk a little bit about our backgrounds and how we bring all these pieces of the puzzle together. So my name is Heidi Wax. I'm a managing director with a company called Stroz Friedberg. We specialize in digital forensics and incident response, but are more comprehensive than that and do both proactive and reactive cybersecurity consulting. But my background has been a little bit of a meandering path where I started as a chief privacy officer. I'm an attorney by training. I dabbled for a few years as a Gartner analyst focused on identity management, and then sort of wound my way into incident response and wound up here at Stroz Friedberg, where I'm not a practicing attorney. We're not a law firm, even though people think it sounds like one. I have had the awesome privilege of working twice in my career with Mike, and now working with Dan at Stroz, and put this Q&A panel together to talk a little bit about the intersection of all these things and why it helps to understand privacy and identity when you're doing incident response, and how all those pieces really play together. So, Mike, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. It's Mike Borgia. I'm a partner at the law firm Davis Wright Tremaine. It's a Seattle-based firm. I'm personally based in Denver. I am a partner within the privacy and security practice group, so it kind of runs a variety of things in privacy compliance and transactions, as well as incident response, security compliance, and all manners of things like that. I've been kind of in this security space in a number of ways. I lead the information security part of the practice, I should mention. It's really kind of my bailiwick. And so I've done this as outside counsel. I've been in-house at a consulting firm as an attorney advising on incident response and privacy issues, and also worked with Heidi and Dan at Stroz Friedberg a number of years ago, more in the consulting role.
My name is Daniel Stein. I'm a manager at Stroz Friedberg, specifically in the digital forensics and incident response service line. So basically, if you're talking to me, chances are you're not having a very good day. I'm the person who is typically leading the investigations. I'm the person asking for access to your environment so that we can perform analysis and get you the answers about what happened, what did they do, and what are your next steps?
I think Dan is selling himself a little bit short. Can you talk a little bit about OpenCTI and what you've developed at Stroz?
Sure. In addition to the investigation bit, we've also stood up an effort to compile all of the threat data that we've observed, over the past few years now, into a single platform. So everything's stored in one place. We have metrics on, what do we see threat actors? How do they get into the environment? What do they do once they're there? It helps us tremendously when, we have all the different IPs, the files, all the malware that we've observed over the past few years, all in one place. And when we show up to the next incident, we can leverage that. So that's been incredibly powerful for us. And we'll be discussing some of that today.
So could we do a little polling, a show of hands? How many people in here have been through an incident? And that's why the people on the stage have job security. And how many of you that have done the incident response have done it in an identity management role? Oh, this is very good news. This warms my heart that many of you have been involved in that, because we don't always see that. We don't always see that kind of cross-functional collaboration in the event of an incident. So we wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the threat landscape and set the threat landscape a little bit, and then we'll get into the Q&A a little bit more. So we, between the three of us, work on hundreds of incidents every year, and they get more and more news every day now. And as you can imagine, the motivation and the types of incidents that we see span quite a wide range. So everything from insider threat, somebody trying to leave and take data with them, We see what I would refer to as administrative voyeurism. So, right, that falls right squarely into the identity management world. Like somebody has access to view something, but they're viewing more often or more frequently than they should. And of course, the motivation for these types of incidents varies. I would say in the last few years, we've probably seen it expand a little bit more across the spectrum than we had in the years before. But of course, the number one that we see the most part is crime. Money, people are after money, like ransomware attacks. But of course, as I mentioned, the insider threat, the espionage a little bit as well. And so this is sort of the world that we live in, that we're seeing, and we're bringing all of our collective expertise to recognize what's going on and deal with what's going on. So we leveraged Dan's data that he's compiled to talk about, generally speaking, how do threat actors get into environments? How do they compromise? What's their initial point of entry? And we see a lot of these tactics over and over and over again. So, you know, it's sort of, you can imagine when something hits the news that there's a known vulnerability, that gets a lot of attention, and all of a sudden we see a whole spate of attacks related to that particular vulnerability. But there are old standbys that don't ever seem to be going away, like phishing. So this is, you know, generally the landscape that we're seeing again for how threat actors are getting in. I don't know if either of you have anything you want to comment on, or if you see one more than another, or if any of these speak to you.
Yeah, so, you know, as with most data sets, there's a bit of a bias here, right? By the time an incident lands in our lap, you know, it's probably the most impactful incidents. If someone clicks on, you know, some link and it, you know, just downloads some unwanted program, chances are we're not getting called. And that's where we see a lot of the drive-by attacks happen. When an incident lands in our lap, typically it's due to either phishing or some sort of internet-facing device being vulnerable. So that's the majority of what we've seen. And let me see. And yeah, and I think where real identity starts playing the big role is, you know, that next step of the incident. And I can't see if that's what we're talking about next, but
I mean, I think you tend to see a combination, and I think as even smaller clients and companies, as their environments have gotten more complicated, maybe, you know, it's hybrid, or they've introduced more network segmentation, things like that. What you see is there's usually a chain. So maybe it's a vulnerability or phishing, but then the threat, it's, you know, in many cases it's not just, well, I got in through phishing and then I had access to everything. Well, so I got, you know, an entry point into a network through phishing, but now I actually need to get to the data I care about. And then often that is because of, you know, a misconfiguration, a vulnerability, excess permissions. There was an account sitting there for years and we forgot to decommission it, things like that. So it's often 3 or 4 or more things that chain together.
So I'm just going to go back and put our faces on the screen, and we're going to talk a little bit more now into the Q&A sort of part, and really getting into the bulk of the discussion. What I'd like to do is sort of start in reverse chronological order, which I know usually most of us are pretty linear type A thinkers, and we want to walk through things in chronological order. But Mike's role in incident response is to serve as outside counsel for his clients, to direct the work of the forensics provider, whether that's us or another firm, a peer firm. But in an incident response investigation, what you're doing internally to try and resolve things is different than where the lawyers may be trying to get. But they're going to need the information that you all have access to answer their questions. So, Mike, can you talk a little bit about, like, at the end, the legal impact analysis, what you're trying to answer, like what is this current state of affairs with the legal and regulatory landscape now, and what are you trying to get to when you're doing the legal analysis?
Yeah, so there's a lot. I think the obvious one, I think that come to people's mind is data breach notification. That's kind of what we all have some personal experience with, that receiving the letters and what have you. And so that's a common question that we're trying to address, is to understand, has there been impact to personal data as defined in, you know, all the different state statutes or some federal statutes, and then what do we have to do about that? Was it has it been breached? Again, is defined in the statute, and then what are our obligations with that? But there's others as well. There's a lot more focus and emphasis by regulators on the quality of security and the controls, whether those controls were reasonable, whether they complied with various regulations that are out there. For most companies, the law really essentially just says you have to have reasonable or appropriate security. There's not that much more. That's kind of a basic state level requirement. There are a few states that have slightly more detailed requirements, but they're kind of just like more detailed ways of saying reasonable and appropriate. So this must include, security policies and access controls and things, right? And it's not really adding a lot to the requirement. And then there are, in some regulated industries, particularly at the federal level, you're going to see more detailed requirements about security. Whether you're a government contractor, you're a financial institution, hospital, things like that. So another thing we're looking at is what is our potential exposure in that. What happened and why, and what, it was a control failure. Did a vulnerability not get patched? Why didn't it get patched? Trying to more anticipate these arguments that could be made by a plaintiff's attorney or a regulator about this, is this reasonable or not? And the first thing you need to do before you make any legal arguments is you need to really understand the facts, to understand what happened and why, and really have a good handle on that, which I think is often easily forgotten, because you really need to understand in a very detailed way why all these things happened. And then lastly, a lot of liability comes from B2B relationships that you might have. So that's another thing we have to think about too. It's not just a statute or a regulation out there. You may have complex relationships with a lot of your corporate customers. So we need to think a lot about what does the contract require us to do? Do we have to notify that company or 100 companies or the world practically? And then beyond that, what's our liability? So the contract might say, well, if there's a breach, you have to do this or that, or if the breach results from X, Y, Z, then there's liability, but if it doesn't, it's not. Typically in a contract, you're not going to see, if you have a data breach, you're liable. It's going to be, you have to adopt the controls, or we go back to old reasonable and appropriate, and if a breach happens because you didn't comply with that, then you'd have liability. So those are kind of the main buckets of things that we're thinking about in terms of the end. There's a lot of things we're doing during the investigation, but we'll talk about that as we go.
Yeah. So going back to the beginning, when an investigation starts out, and it sounds like many of you have been through this. First of all, there's a lot of confusion, and everyone's rushing around in 10 million different directions and trying to figure out who owns what and who's going to do this and who's going to look at that. The who owns what piece and the who has access to what piece is probably the first stumbling block that we encounter when conducting an incident investigation. But in the beginning, basically, we're like Daniel said, if somebody calls us, they're having a really bad day, and they call us at all hours of the day or night. Actually, when I was here last year, I got a call at 5:30 a.m. because I'm based on the East Coast, and somebody assumed that I was home. My phone started ringing for something that was going on while I was here. So these things happen at all times of the day or night, and you start asking questions like, "What happened? What do you know? Who got in? How did they get there?" And so we're kicking off the investigation. We'll gloss through the legal and contractual stuff about how we actually get signed up and engaged, but probably 90% of the matters that we investigate are done at the direction of outside counsel in tandem with somebody in a role like Mike's. And then what happens is we kick it off and Daniel steps in. And so can you talk, Dan, like a little bit about what you're asking for access to? What are you looking to do at the outset of an incident to gain access, to gather evidence? Like, what type of things do you need?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we jump on for an incident, we are looking for basically the lowest hanging fruit, any sort of evidence that might give us an idea of where to start looking, right? And so chances are there are some sort of security tools in place. Maybe logs are being collected in a central location in a SIM, and we need access to that. And the sooner we can get access to that, the sooner we can direct our efforts into following the data and the evidence back to figure out, how did this all start, and then working forward to figure out what did they do. So specifically, a SIM solution If there's an EDR solution in place, we'll want access to that. Oftentimes, there are some other security tools like a firewall that we'll be interested in, especially if we find out early on that there's a vulnerable firewall at the perimeter. Chances are that's where we're going to start looking. If there's an email component, Office 365 credentials, not just 365 credentials, but a specific role that will allow us to pull the data that we need in a timely manner. And oftentimes when we get engaged, it's not, the tail end of the event, it's an ongoing incident. So the speed with which we get that access can be paramount to, was this a mitigated incident and we can now learn some lessons, or do we have some recovery to do and we have to get the business back up because we weren't able to act fast enough. Some of the challenges that we face around getting that access, oftentimes, clients will have processes in place, and there are standard processes, and then there's what happens when an incident response hits, in which case either you'll stick to your plan, which isn't appropriate for an active incident, or everything gets thrown out the door, and you just there's no tracking of what user was generated, where was a laptop shipped. So having a process in place for when an incident hits where you can move quickly but still track things is very important. And whether it involves shipping a physical laptop, provisioning an account in Active Directory with the proper permissions and the proper roles, VPN access. Again, the sooner we can get those things, the sooner we can start answering the questions and directing our response.
And it's really important from a legal perspective as well. You've really got to have some process to provision access really quickly, which it kind of goes against. I get why this should be hard, especially under normal circumstances. A third party should be able to say, "Hey, I want access." And like, here you go, here's an account. It should be hard, but it has to be fast in this case. Obviously, there's clear security reasons why, right? We need to get people in here and investigate and stop this. But from a legal perspective, if it's taking days to get an account, what's also happening is evidence is being lost. Things are rolling over, and we don't even necessarily know because the investigators aren't in and they don't even know what's relevant. So you might say, well, okay, we'll just preserve logs while we're waiting for access, but which logs? Some might be obvious. Well, we know the firewall logs, and maybe we're going to preserve those. But where else has this attacker been? And do we know? And were they on a server? Are there logs on that server that are being overwritten right now? Because we didn't know that yet. So getting that quickly and getting some lay of the land is really vital, and it just counsels in favor of having some kind of break glass process to say, I know that normally we're really, really conservative about this, especially with third parties, but in this case we just have to get it done because it's on a lesser of two evils or whatever you want to call it, but it's necessary.
So we keep talking about threat actors getting into the environment and trying to figure out what they're doing. But one thing I think maybe we should touch on a little bit is where it sits squarely in the identity management world, which is whose credentials are they using? How are they elevating privileges, escalating privileges? How are they getting to the places that they're trying to go? What are those credentials? Why have they been sitting there? How did they get compromised? And so Dan, maybe could you talk a little bit about your experience in investigating all sorts of unauthorized access and ransomware type matters, and talking about what it looks like when those credentials are compromised, how they get them, and how that all sort of fits together.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we come across an incident, chances are the patient zero, whoever it is, chances are they weren't an admin. So 99% of the incidents that we work, there's a step of escalating privileges from wherever they got in to wherever they need to be to cause an impact, to steal data, to steal money, as Mike mentioned earlier. So, and that's where I think identity management really comes into play, because that's where we can make their jobs as difficult as possible, and that can extend our time to react and kick them out before they can cause some damage. How do they normally do this? There are a few different ways. A lot of times it really is just a vulnerability. A lot of times we think about vulnerabilities as the way into an environment, but even within an environment, there's vulnerable software. A lot of legacy Microsoft operating systems have vulnerabilities that can be exploited to get domain admin credentials or whatever other credentials are on that particular system. But a lot of times it's not the vulnerabilities even. Threat actors know to target password stores, and they're able to identify them relatively quickly. They're able to identify, loose files with, just passwords in a text file and leverage those. We see them going after browser credentials stored in browsers as well. And that goes a little bit to the question of why are those credentials there? Is there a process in place or a lack of process that makes it difficult for a user to store those passwords in a better place? And so, this was the easiest solution for them, and now it's introduced this risk. Password management tools, a process for rotating those passwords, all of that's important, and making that easier for users is important, so that we don't make it easy for the attackers once they're in the environment.
Yeah, I think that's, I think one thing we've all learned, and maybe some of you have learned as well, is that the threat actors are looking for the easiest way to their goal. They are not looking, there are some who are stealthy and they're trying to get intellectual property and trade secrets, and those are a lot of more of like sort of the nation state actors, and that's a whole nother issue. But most of the threat actors who get in, they're looking like for the path of least resistance, and everyone has a part, privacy, security, identity, in putting up as many roadblocks as possible to prevent them from getting to their goal. So we see plenty of incidents where once they get a foothold in the environment, they're going straight to the domain controller. Like they just know that's where everything lives. They're looking for, all the credentials they can get, all the admin credentials they can get. They are searching within the environment for password.txt, and it exists way more times than we would like it to exist on people's computers. And so we do see that behavior. So a lot of this, again, is sort of like understanding where are the identity management critical pieces, who's putting up those roadblocks, and to the earlier point, who's able to remove them when we need to get in to do an investigation.
Yeah, and this gets to, I think, a really foundational question that people talk a lot about in security, and you could think about this here, is like structural, meaning where did certain organizations sit and what's their incentive to do the things that they do. And so one iteration of this that often comes up is like, where does the CISO sit? Right? Is that person report to the CIO? Is that a kind of a conflict, if you will? And you can see how this like cascade down to identity management as well, because we all, after an incident, we can all sit there and be like, well, that was really stupid that, this person could do these things. They clearly shouldn't have been able to do that, or the password was password or whatever. But the reality is you're an employee sitting in a company, and maybe you're an IT engineer, you're setting something up, and you say, well, all right, well, I could do this like the hard way, the good way, right? And if I do that, the business people are going to be mad at me, and they're going to yell, and there's too many roadblocks in this thing, I can't use it. And if I don't do it the right way, probably nothing will happen. So I'm going to just do it, I'll do it the wrong way, right? Because then I won't get yelled at, and people won't give me a hard time, and I won't have to figure out like where all the, where all the service accounts are hard-coded, and it's going to break everything, and go on and on and on, right? And then the breach happens, and then everyone comes back to that person and is like, hey, idiot, like why did you, why was the password? Like, well, it was easy. And I didn't want to get yelled at by the business people, so that's how I did it. And so it's an important question to think about sort of where, for identity management in that role, sort of like what is your relationship to security, and are you like a client of security? Are you part of security? Does security just kind of tell you stuff, and then you're like, that's interesting, but I don't actually have to do that? It's a real problem, and it's a problem or many parts of an organization, but it's worth thinking about how to actually make this real, because it's not realistic before a breach to say like add lots of roadblocks. Like no one is going to go for that, unless you can try to create incentive for people to actually do that.
Yeah. I think it might be helpful to do a little bit of storytelling of some of the things that we've seen where these identity management and privacy issues intersect when we're actually doing incident response. So I can give one example and talk a little bit about it, and I know Dan has another example that's he's working on that's far more complex and complicated. But I had a situation where I got a very panicked call from a senior executive at a nonprofit client that I'd worked with before. And somebody was leaking donor information to the press. And, people like to keep that information private for many reasons, whether the organization is aligned with a certain cause that people don't want it to be known about. Maybe it's aligned with a certain medical condition and they don't want you to know that you even know about the medical condition or whatever. There's lots of reasons why people want their donor data to be kept private. And I know we talk a lot, especially at this in this world, about sort of the commercial and the workforce space and the customer identities, but the nonprofit space and higher ed as well, they have their own unique challenges in terms of this type of data. So I get a very panicked call. We don't know what's going on, but we know that we're getting inquiries from reporters and one reporter, and the reporter just has way too much information. Like the call is definitely coming from inside the house. How do we figure out who the person is that's leaking the information to the media to try and shame some of our biggest ticket donors? And how do they even know that these are the biggest ticket donors? And it turned out that they were using, and I'm not endorsing or demonizing this methodology, but they were using Salesforce to track all of their donor data. Like they were basically using Salesforce as their CRM, but like plus all the donor data. And the part that I'm not endorsing or denying is that they had 200 people within the organization who had unfettered access to this environment with all the information. And not extensive logging turned on. So to try and figure out who was the person that was looking at these particular, we're like, well, let's just look at who looked at these 5 donor records and figure it out. Well, they didn't have that kind of logging in place. And also there were so many people that had access to it and had legitimate access to it that it was like almost impossible to reverse engineer it. And so basically in the end, we figured out who it was by doing some unrelated threat intel work. We have a threat intelligence division in our company, and they were able to determine that one particular employee's spouse was making posts on social media that were against the mission of the organization. So they backtracked and they said, we think this is probably the right person. But it led to some pretty extensive conversations with this organization about, we really need to talk about information governance and identity management, because this is just if you're high profile enough that somebody wants to leak your donor data to the press, then you need to level up the way you're paying attention to your identity management and your information governance. And it was the direct smack intersection of privacy and identity management, right? Because it was also about how do you tag data? How do you make donor names confidential within the system if needed to? How do you protect individuals' privacy? And how do you restrict all this? And so that's, like I said, not everything is a ransomware attack. We get calls, Daniel categorizes the type of matters that we see, and it's for our statistics. And I keep asking us to create a weird and funky matter category, where it's just like all the one-off stuff that doesn't fall into a nice other category, because we do a bunch of that. And it's stuff like that. And when it is stuff like that, you have to be able to speak multiple languages. You have to be able to speak privacy. You have to be able to speak security. You have to be able to speak identity management in a way that the executives understand that there are multiple forces at play here. So I think Dan also has a little bit of a storytelling to do about one that he's working on or has worked on recently.
Yeah, and this is another one where, privacy and security just, the way they intersected just really hit for me, because in this particular situation, the threat actor gained access to actually 2 individual users' single sign-on credentials. Single sign-on is great. It makes a lot of people's lives easier. I'm all for it. But it's one of those things where once you get it, you pretty much have keys to the castle, or at least keys to the castle based on whatever access the user had. And figuring out what access did the user have in the first place, figuring out for each of those application, who's the application owner, what kind of data resides in that application. That was less of a forensic process. There was plenty of forensics involved, but the amount of effort, roughly, 45 or so different application owners that we needed to speak to understand, does this login event from this single sign-on tool, does it mean actually that they authenticated, or could they have, appear to have logged into the single sign-on tool, but not actually made it into the tool? And that, brings up this interesting, sort of Venn diagram of responsibilities between security and application owner and identity management that, in this case was really impactful, and for this company was, incredibly impactful. They were in the middle of an acquisition. They needed to tell them, hey, the buying organization that, we're all good, but they needed to do that for 45 or so different applications. And so, not everyone is facing that kind of risk. They're not everyone's in the middle of an acquisition, but you still need to be able to tell partner organizations, clients, customers that, things are secure. And the more, difficult you create that segregation, the more difficult that ask becomes. And so I'm not sure that, whether it's like role-based grouping, there's not, I think, a simple solution to that problem. But going to Mike's point about incentives, I think that is something that's really important to examine because, for some people, their incentive or them being good at their jobs is getting people the access they need when they need it. But that can change during an incident. And so finding that balance of, least privilege, but also easy access so that the business isn't disrupted, it's a job that I think belongs to not just one team. I think it's a shared mission, and that's where I think, the communication and, aligning the incentives properly becomes really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that tied out to what I was saying. I think that if you're, as an identity management person, you may find yourself often kind of sitting there thinking, like, sort of incentive-wise, being too restrictive, right? It has like a clear consequence for my life, again, because I get yelled at and someone complains, I'm going to do this and that. And being overly permissive doesn't. That's a hypothetical consequence for my life. Except then when there's a breach, and then everyone is like, why did this person have some? So it's having that incentives beforehand too, to be able to say that, like, this, it's not just about, and I think this is where a lot of companies go wrong, is that they don't, the incentives are never really baked in. So they're just kind of whatever happens to exist. And again, what happens to exist is there's people who need access to stuff and they're always on me about it. And that's what I'm going to respond to. And everything else feels hypothetical. And if there's a pen test, let's say, and someone says, oh, we found this account and it's got way too much access, I don't have to do anything about that. Like, I should do something about it, but what do I actually have to do about it? Because if I then start ratcheting that down, then people say, oh, well, this doesn't work, and this doesn't work, and I can't do this anymore, and then it's all about convenience, right? And then that goes badly. One thing I was going to say too is, I think how often this stuff goes wrong in, like, the exceptions, that a lot of companies are really good at sort of knowing, okay, we've got this data, here's our customer data, it's really important, and we're really good about provisioning access to that. But then a lot of times copies of that get, like, dumped or wherever, or we got lots of internal data, and I don't know, that's just kind of around. And you see this a lot with, like, professional service consulting firms or things like that, even law firms that have incidents, is just like, who can access this? You're like, I mean, anyone can access anything, right? I mean, not in, like, the critical data that we know is restricted, whatever its application that we have, but once you get outside that and people start putting stuff on SharePoint or whatever, anything goes. There's, like, no restrictions on that at all. And that comes back to bite really hard, because we've seen a lot of incidents, especially recently, with this kind of big swell of SIM swapping, that you swap a SIM card, you reset the user's password through self-service password reset, whatever it is. Maybe you've got SMS enabled for two-factor, and then you're getting the account, and I can access anything that this person whose account I've taken over, anything that they can access in this company's Microsoft tenant. And for like many companies, that's just like everything, right? Anything that's on SharePoint, it's very few restrictions. A second place is like the company has like, you know, like Sue, who's worked here for like 20 years and is like the only person who knows how to do everything. And then, you know, that person's not an admin per se, they're not an administrator, but you look at their account and like this person can do everything and talk to everything. Because it like in the last 25 years, there was like one time where this was like an important use case and it's never been kind of audited. And you see that a lot, is that you've got this one account for this person that can do anything. And the attackers know this, and they will try to socially engineer those people. They can try to identify them online and then start emailing them because they know, oh, that's the person that has access to the bank accounts, that knows how to process payments, that knows all the exceptions to the payments, whereas most people like know one of those things.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. I think we've run into many times this situation where through all sorts of various unauthorized access, and sometimes actually this is nation state stuff, this is not just like ransomware, but when somebody gets into the environment, we can see that they traverse to like a file share, for example, and we have to have these conversations where like, well, what was stored on that file share? I don't know. Who owned it? What users were storing things and documents and data there? I don't know. Well, we see like this username. Oh, that person left the company like 3 years ago. So like their accounts are gone, but like the documents that they created or the files that they created are still left there. And maybe those contain sensitive or confidential information or trade secrets, and some nation state actor came looking for them. So to be able to answer those questions really involves, you know, identity stakeholders. I have another polling question for the audience. For those of you, how many of you have been invited to take part in an incident response tabletop exercise? So I know you get called on, see like a lot less hands that went up. How many people have actually participated in an incident or responded to an incident versus actually get called in up front to talk about what your role might be and how you might help? And I think a lot of our incident response tabletops, and we're sort of guilty of this as well, is a lot of the tabletop exercises and the incident response proactive planning focus on whatever's in the news today. So if you were planning one tomorrow, you might focus on SIM swapping because it's in the news right now, and everyone wants to do a ransomware tabletop. They want to do executive ones, they want to do technical ones, but very rarely do we have tabletop exercises where identity management is critical to the plot line of the tabletop. So to have a tabletop exercise where you're like, well, what if somebody got access to the SSO platform and they were just, I mean, I've had incidents like that too, where somebody's like literally like they figure out the platform page and they're hopping in and out of all the apps that the individual user has access to. And we're like, well, what did they do inside each app? I don't know. There's like 50 apps here. Which ones did they go into? What did they do while they were in there? What can this user do? I don't know. I mean, these are the types of things that I think all of us maybe have a piece of the puzzle in elevating the role of identity and who are the stakeholders and being part of those conversations. Because when we're fumbling around and looking for the right person to answer these questions, it's like way too late.
Yeah, I mean, a good tabletop it should be tactical. Like everyone wants to talk about, like, would you pay the ransom? It's like the most favorite, everyone's favorite topic. But and that's fun, but it's actually not a very useful topic for a tabletop. You don't really need a tabletop like debating we're going to pay the ransom. You can do that should it become necessary. What you really do need to tabletop out is the tactics of like, how are we going to do this stuff? How do we get access to the vendor? Let's say that we think there was unauthorized access to 50 applications. Who's going to do that? Like, who owns those applications and who? Because you can't just stick a vendor on like 50 applications. It's like, did something bad happen? They're going to have to come to you and say, here's stuff happened, but like, is it bad? We're going to need some context potentially, especially if it's like a proprietary app. You know, how are you logging things? What do the logs mean? And how are we going to do that? And I think the difference often between success and lack of success in an incident is that there are companies that like are really good at knowing like, here's how we're going to get this done. We don't know the answer, but we know we have processes. And on the other end of the spectrum, it's like you spend the weeks just trying to figure out like whose job is it to do this?
Yeah.
And we don't know.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit, Mike, about like these types of examples? Which are the ones that make the legal analysis like the worst nightmare? Which are the situations that you hate to see or are barriers to doing your piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, well, a very obvious practical one is the unstructured data, like the file share, right? Because that's if an attacker gets into a database and it's like, all right, what fields are in the database? That's not usually that hard of a question. It's harder than it sounds in many cases, but it's not that hard. What is really hard is if they, the attackers download a terabyte of data from a file share that has been used for years, and like, well, what data is in there? It's like anything. Who knows? It's data. It's our own data. It's data of random clients, I guess. I mean, to go through that is just a massive exercise. You've got to have people like, well, we use software to assist, right? But going through and like looking at trying to identify social security numbers. You've got documents like which of our clients does this document pertain to? Do we have to notify that? It's an absolute disaster. So that's one of them. And I mean, that is like, that can be like $1 million problem when you're talking about like, well, we need people to be analyzing this data for weeks or months. And it's just massively complicated. Question.
Time is not your friend in an attack. Are you trying to develop AI tools to crunch data? And have you seen the landscape change and the vectors change for hackers using AI tools?
So I can say that one of our colleagues has actually been, one of mine and Dana's colleagues has been studying this a little bit, particularly in phishing attacks, that they're seeing a significant rise of the use of threat actors using AI in phishing attacks. And things that used to be really easy to catch, like poor grammar and poor English, are sort of fading a little bit more to the background as the threat actors are figuring out that they can use AI for that. I would say sort of like on the back end on how we do our analysis or what we're doing, we build a host of proprietary tools that use all sorts of various resources. I would say for those of us in the privacy and cybersecurity space, maybe we're a little bit more cautious about using AI tools and understanding what they're going to look like and how they're going to be used before we're jumping in headfirst.
Do you see any increases in time bomb attacks where somebody did something 6 months ago, cleaned their place out, scheduled the task to happen, so the logs are gone pretty much until that attack hits?
I haven't seen a lot of that. I don't know if you guys have.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one because the entire to schedule an attack to go off for an impact to happen weeks, months down the line. Putting myself in the attacker's shoes, I'm increasing, I think, the risk that gets caught out before I can actually gain any benefit. So from an objective perspective, I can see how maybe that might happen. For someone who's targeting a website for like a defacement or something like that, there's a bit more of a slant of
We did an insurance company, let's say I work for an insurance company,
So do we.
Yeah.
and you compromise one or two process IDs that are running that have good access, and you set up your code. That process ID is running day and night. You know it's not going to get taken out because it seems vital. You schedule your task, and boom, your data gets encrypted.
So again, we haven't seen a lot. I will say what we are starting to see a little bit of, but I think some of us think it might be the beginning of a bigger trend, is threat actors, particularly in the ransomware space, finding sort of a target inside the company and brokering a deal and saying, hey, you help us do this, or you give us our credentials and we'll give you a percentage of the payout.
I'm sure a lot of contractors are using bot or disgruntled workers, which you can find all over
I mean, I have,
social media.
yeah. I mean, look, these are you could go to security conferences for the last 2 decades and hear discussions about these types of things, third-party security, vendor security. We still see all of those. All of those things are still happening. I've had conversations about all of these things, and there are like real life lessons you can learn from movies that are like 2 decades old, 3 decades old. Like my favorite is, and we've had Mike and I've had. If you watch Jurassic Park, it is not a movie about dinosaurs. It is an insider threat movie. Yeah. And he gets in, and the one guy has control of the entire system. Right? It's identity management. It's insider threat. And he takes the whole system offline. And then the dinosaurs come out. But what actually is going on is it's an IT movie. Yeah. And the girl who saves the day is like, I'm a hacker. I got this. I know how to bring this back online, you know? And all of these lessons have been out there in pop culture for us to learn.
Yeah.
We have another question.
We know that, I mean, we've seen this, especially the Bitcoin and other financial services, but hackers will go to people in the company and say, I will pay you X if you give me this many email addresses or this many credentials. And we've had clients that know, like, all of our employees are being pinged with this. And we have a client whose one employee went for it. And he went to jail, so don't do that. But it happens.
But he can only go to jail if they catch him.
That's true. The other quick point I was making about AI, because I think it's important here, is it's going to really shift one of the paradigms that we have, which is, you know, we rely a lot on people. We always have to rely on people for sure. But as a first line of defense, you know, we train people like, here's what a phishing email looks like, don't click on it. And that's going to get harder, and that's going to put more pressure on things like identity management to say, we just have to assume that that first line is going to fail every time or most of the time. And so we've got to have things backing that up, because we're no longer going to be able to say, like, look at how terribly this email was written, or like you're going to be able to study, and it's not just better English, but it's also understanding, you know, what is this person's job, what kind of things are relevant to them, what kind of communications would they get, what time of day would they get them, and start submitting that.
I think we had another question. Yeah.
At the beginning, you mentioned OpenCTI. Can you talk more about how you leverage that and how you use that to assist your customers in an investigation?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who aren't familiar, OpenCTI is an open source threat intelligence platform. For us, that's where we store our threat data for each of the incidents that we work, and we also ingest, you know, external data as well. So a few things there. You know, it has some really good features around, you know, creating knowledge and relationships, as opposed to some other solutions like a MISP, where you have a bunch of indicators and you can tag them, but you don't get the granular relationships. You know, this threat actor uses these tools and this malware, and here are all of our hashes, here are all of our indicators of that particular tool, and you can kind of start building a bigger picture, you know, of, you know, a threat actor's MO. So we use it, you know, for storage, and, you know, we implement it in our analysis. But then, you know, when we get some free time, we take a step back and see, you know, what are we observing, you know, in the landscape? What have we seen over the past few months? How have things changed? And, you know, we'll put out some material, sometimes externally, sometimes just, you know, for our internal team, for them to be aware about, you know, of things to look out for. Yeah.
There's another question.
So mine's kind of two-part, actually. So you had mentioned early on that one of the first stumbling blocks that you guys run into is figuring out who owns what. In your opinion, what's the best way to control access, update that information? And then secondfold, ensuring that when you call, say, a domain admin, that the person that you are calling is actually the domain admin.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So for the first question about, you know, how to, you know, identify and kind of have that information stored and readily available, I think that kind of goes back to a little bit of the incentives and like the greater mission bit around, you know, whose responsibility is that? And I think in my opinion, it's a shared responsibility. I think that between identity, security, you know, application ownership, all three of them are responsible for making sure, you know, that in a pinch, the resources are available and that data is stored centrally. You know, a lot of times when we show up to an incident, they're not even aware of all the applications that they have running in the environment. That in itself is hard enough. So, you know, there are some tools that certainly help out with this, but I think, you know, making that an end goal in the first place is really the first step, because, you know, having that as a goal, as a direction, as a, you know, just like a state of being, you know, if we're introducing a new application, we need to know, you know, who's the owner, who's the backup escalation point, where is it deployed, what rights do the users have, what are the different roles. You know, there are certainly some tools that help with that, but I think for a lot of groups, you know, they don't really need to do that. That's not required for them. They just, they're just happy to stand up the application, provision ownership, and that's it. So that's my thoughts. And
Yeah, I think the other thing is that one person, it doesn't have to be one person who owns all of that, right? I think part of this is just who are you going to go to that can answer this question? So an understanding throughout the organization that when you need to figure these things out, who is the right person to go to? And one of the things that we see consistently are disconnects between privacy, security, compliance, legal, identity management. And you need, everyone's got to, hold hands and become besties. Because not even only in an incident, I mean, on a day-to-day, there should be much more cross-function discussion when you're standing these things up about tracking who owns it, who's, all of these things. It's not one person.
I think two things to this. I think one is, if you want something to happen, if you want someone to do something, it ideally needs to be in their job description or part of their performance or compensation. You're not really going to have success if you say, you sysadmin need to maintain documentation, but if you don't, nothing happens, and if you do, nothing happens, right? So who cares? So making this actually part of their role, and not just in a negative way. Sometimes this is all well, if you don't do this, that's bad, and if you don't do that, that's bad. It could be, if you do this, that's good. I also think you need processes, right? Especially if you're talking about documentation and system owners and all that. It's going to get out of date. It's going to get out of date all the time, and so I think clients that do pretty well, they have a yearly risk assessment or annual, security assessment. And part of that is just we go through and we audit this and we're this documentation's out of date, that documentation's out of date. Because again, people are busy. They're not going to be able to keep this up day to day. But, if you're saying, well, look, our documentation is updated within about a year, it's not ideal, but that's probably better than almost everybody.
And then I can't remember what the second part of your question was.
How do you ensure that when you call a domain admin that it's actually the
You're getting the right person. Yeah. That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that.
I actually ran across that recently, actually at the same incident that I mentioned before when we were talking to a bunch of application owners. They knew that there was an incident, if it's really impactful, most employees do. And they know that there's a lot of phishing going around, a lot of people pretending to know a lot of information and asking for, whether it's credentials or MFA. And a few times I had got the question of this is exactly the sort of thing what we're looking for. Your account was recently created here. You're a contractor. How do I trust you? And so I think that what's important, I think, in that situation is having a primary and a backup way of communicating. So, if it's Slack, for example, that's your primary method of communication. Maybe ask for, a phone call or an email, basically increasing the number of applications or methods of communications that the user has access to in order to validate that they are who they say they are.
So-
we had a situation at my previous company where we called somebody that we thought was, because that was the phone number, right? The domain admin, and they had to patch the person had the person that called them patch them into the major incident bridge, and come to find out it wasn't actually the domain admin.
Yeah. We're way over. Sorry about that. But thank you, everyone, for being here and joining us. And we're happy to answer any other questions if you want to hang around. Thank you.
Thank you.